Hi and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode number 70, and today I'm going to be talking about sideboarding in draft. But before we go into that, this show is sponsored by mtgazone.com, a place where you can read all about this podcast, for example, as I'm going to write up this seminar in the form of an article, but also from other people that deal with limited, like J2S Josh and some other guys from Draft Lab podcast or Draft Lab group. There's people writing about standard, constructed. There's really a good collection of people uh, finding most recent deck lists that you can net deck, especially for limited players that maybe are not as invested in constructed. That's quite a useful resource. And general articles about anything you want, really. And apart from mtgazone.com, this podcast is sponsored by you listeners. Well, not all of you, but at least the ones that joined the Patreon scheme. And it's available at patreon.com/Sherkovitz. You can get extra bonuses like access to my slides, ability to ask the question of the week, and some other things. So check out the Patreon and consider becoming my patron if you think that this content is valuable. Okay, with that out of the way, we can go into the preamble. And this week, I thought that the preamble might be as well linked to the topic. And I think that sideboarding in draft is one of the least covered aspects of deck building. And this is especially strange because I understand why gameplay does not get that much content in form of podcast because it's just difficult to find good examples. But arguably, gameplay is the most important part of the drafting, and it doesn't get enough data coverage. It doesn't get enough content coverage. However, sideboarding seems like quite a straightforward topic to cover, and there are not that many podcasts that deal specifically with sideboarding and especially looking at data. And this was surprising to me because there is good data on sideboarding. Yes, you need to work a bit to get it out of the mysterious 17 lens Excel sheets, but if you want to, you can do that, and you can start drawing some kind of conclusions. And this is exactly what I'm going to try today. Now, obviously, there is not a tremendous amount of data, and it is sometimes problematic to look through. And I would love to maybe be able to go a bit deeper than I did go today into the topic, but that would require some really painstaking data extraction. So what I got is probably a good introduction to sideboarding data, but you have to start somewhere. So we're going to start here. And since data-driven content is mainly considering deck building, this is exactly why I found it slightly surprising that sideboarding does not get coverage. So without further, let's look at some general trends. And there is... So first question that I wanted to answer was, do people at all sideboard in their games? And I took data from a best of three, and I looked at the number of games when 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 cards are being exchanged compared to the previous version of the deck. Oh. And what I found was that around 64%, 65% of the games, there is absolutely no sideboarding done. So the deck is exactly the same as the deck in the previous game. And in 27% of the games, we see a one change, which means that one card has been sideboarded out and one card has been put in from the sideboard. And then more aggressive sideboards, changing two cards, it's still 6.2%, which is not a lot at all. And changing three cards, that already happens only 1% of the time. And then you go into the fractions of a percentage for the games where you exchange multiple cards. This is not really surprising. I mean, maybe it's partially surprising that there is so many games without any sideboarding changes. I found that a bit, maybe not shocking, but at least a bit interesting that 2/3 of the game you don't change. But then on the other hand, I do remember when I play my best of three drafts in the FNM, I sometimes just don't bother sideboarding because it takes time and mental energy, and I have to remember to undo my changes and stuff like that. So I sometimes skip it. However, in Arena, when you're playing for some sort of stakes, I would expect maybe a slightly higher number of those changes. And especially in the current era of limited, when you are never struggling for playables in your draft, you should have at least dedicated spots that you can sideboard. And hopefully, second part of the seminar is going to help you to identify cards that are going to be excellent as sideboard options, and why those cards are so excellent sideboard options. And looking at the numbers of some of the cards that are the best sideboard cards in the recent year, you can see that they are probably worth quite a high pick, because they will, maybe not in every draft, but in some games they will just be a deciding factor of you winning that particular game. Obviously, the longer the tournament, the more important sideboard is. I'm pretty sure that if you would look at the big sealed deck tournaments with multiple rounds, you will see that people that are on the top of the tables are having very good sideboards, and they are using them quite a lot. I think maybe in free match draft, it's not as important as it would be in longer tournaments. And also the stakes are slightly lower, so people maybe sometimes just say, whatever, I'm just going to play the same thing as I played in the first game, especially if they won. So these are the numbers in terms of how many cards people exchange in their sideboarding. And what I was wondering when I looked at it is there any kind of trend that I can find? And third thing that I thought is, I can look at the win rate of the players that are sideboarding and maybe check what are they doing differently based on their win rate. So here we have a player win rate from roughly 0.4 to 0.7, so between 40% win rate and 70% win rate. And here we have the percentage of the games where there is no sideboarding. And it's not a very clear trend, but it's I would say a trend nonetheless. The lower the win rate of the players, the less they sideboard. It basically, at 40% win rate, it's roughly 65% of the games where there is no sideboarding changes made. And if you go to the 70% win rate bracket of players, this drops to more like 63, 62%. So the trend is not very strong, and there is a reason for it. A reason that maybe we will see in the next in the next graph. So yeah, if you would really maybe try to nitpick, there might be this kind of relationship in there. Obviously, you would need more data, and maybe I would need to cluster some of those bins of players together to get something useful out of it. But it might be that people who are in the sort of this mid range of the win rate between 50 and 56, they sideboard actually the least. Maybe. I can't really guarantee you that. So yeah, that's something to consider. Then I decided to look at games with one card sideboarded in, if there is some kind of trend, because obviously there's going to be a bunch of games when there are multiple cards swapped. And the interesting part is that when we look at the games with only one card sideboarded in, the trend is much more clear. It's almost linear. It goes up. So the higher the player's win rate, the more games they will sideboard exactly one card in. And I think that this is something to think. It's the good players that don't do dramatic changes to their decks. They change one card, but they do it more frequently than the players who are winning less. And, we go from roughly 24% of games to roughly 29% of the games in case of the high win rate players. So that's actually quite a big difference between how often they change this one card. I don't have it as a graph, but this sort of means that the players who have a lower win rate very often do big sideboarding changes, and that rarely happens with the good players. And this may mean that they forgot to change their deck, they change their build, and they have to do it during the sideboard, or they are not sure what they should be playing, and they're making big changes because they have to try to win the last two games to win the match. while the players with a higher win rate might know exactly what they want to do. They have one card that will be good against the particular opponent. They are putting that one card, maybe sometimes two cards. But actually, when you look at this relationship with two cards sideboarded in its reverse, so it's the players with lower win rate that sideboard two cards more frequently than the players with the higher win rates. The third thing I wanted to check in terms of general trends on sideboarding is looking at the importance of information on sideboarding decisions. And yeah, basically what I can see from here is that I'm looking at the relationship between the length of the previous game, so the game before the sideboarding, and the percentage of the games with no sideboard. And what you can see here is an absolutely clear trend. The shorter the previous game was, the higher the chance that there will be no sideboarding before the game number 2 or number 3, depending on when the sideboarding was taking place. So in case of short game 1, games that lasted like 4 turns, you have 78% of the games after that had no sideboarding. When you go to games that lasted 8 turns, it drops to 65%. And when you drop to 12 turn games, before it was 57%. And if you go to 14, 15, 16 turn games, like really long ones, it's almost half of the games where sideboarding has been taken place. So what you can see from here is that 17 Lands users, at least, there is a clear link between how much information they saw from the opponent and how much sideboarding changes they do. This means to me that people would sideboard more if they would know more about their opponent's decks. And this is actually a good argument for me in favor of open deck lists in Limited. Because then when you think about it, if you know all of your opponent's deck, independent of how long was the game taking place, you are going to sideboard better, and you're increasing your chance of winning the games by correct playing. In case of closed deck lists, when you just saw 15 cards of the opponent, maybe 14 cards of the opponent, and majority of them were lands, for example, you have no information to act on, and therefore, because of the lack of how the opponent drew in the first game, you might do wrong sideboarding choices because you have very imperfect information. And I think that this would, of course, benefit the most successful players the most, because they are capable of assessing how to sideboard well and much better than the beginners. But I think that among the listeners and watchers of this podcast, most of the people aspire to be in that well-informed and strategically inclined group, and therefore it would be beneficial for you to actually know what the opponent has in their decks. So these are the general trends in sideboarding. I think that this one is particularly striking because it shows that sideboarding is linked to the amount of information you get. It's not just something that happens randomly. It's not that you have or don't have a sideboard. It's more that sometimes you just don't know what you should do if you have very little information about what the opponent is playing. And the more information you get, the more informed sideboarding choices you can make. So with that general trend part out of the way, I can move on to what I called very proudly sideboard Oscars. And so sideboard Oscars, I decided to look at several metrics linked to sideboarding, like cards that are mostly used as sideboard cards, and how skewed is the ratio of that kind of use. How do those cards work out? Which ones are successful and which ones are maybe less successful? And also try to look at what were the traits of good sideboard cards and what are the traits of the ones that are not so good, or at least don't show a good result. And then in order to look at the cards in a stringent way, I did a very simple analysis. I took cards from best of three, and I looked at cards that have 15% or more games played in game two than in game one. So if you look at the best of three data from 17 lands, you just need to basically calculate how many games were played with a particular card in game one and how many games were played with a particular card in game two. And if it's 15% or more higher in game two, I took those cards as sideboard cards. And some of them had way more than way more than 15% advantage. Okay, so the first category in our sideboard Oscars is the most sideboardy cards. And by most sideboardy, I meant the number of games played in game two is is much more higher than in game one. And I calculated this ratio. So so basically, I divide the number of games two plays of the card by the number of game one plays of the card, and then calculate those ratio. So here we are. These are the cards. The winner is Lucky Offering, and this card is played 8 times more in game two than in game one. Now, I know that you know all the playables and all the stars of Limited from the last years, but I did assume that very much like me, you don't know all of those cards because some of them are quite obscure. And if you do, good on you. If you don't worry. I decided that this time I'm going to put the card pictures next to some of the more obscure ones, in case you don't remember them. Lucky Offering is a sorcery for white from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, and it says destroy target artifact with mana value 3 or less, and you gain 3 life. This was an excellent card. I see that Jordan in the chat. Oh, he must have seen quite some few copies of that card in the best of 3. And probably in best of 1, knowing luck. Because this card was excellent against the mono red artifact deck in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. It was probably also quite good against some versions of red black, maybe blue and red, maybe some other types of blue decks that had a high number of cheap artifacts. It also could have been played against some kind of black-white decks that were operating on the synergy between having artifacts and enchantments in play. And this card, it's just probably not good enough to be played in the main deck. But if you find a deck that has multiple cheap artifacts, this is going to be excellent because it kills something of them for 1 mana. You gain 3 life, you gain advantage on both mana, board presence, and everything. Allows you to double spell very easily, so it looks like quite a good inclusion of the from the sideboard against a deck that you know has multiple of those cheap artifacts. The second card that was almost exclusively sideboard, and it was played 7 times more in game 2 than in game 1, is Smash to Dust. That's a multimodal card, 1 in red sorcery from Dominaria United. You can choose 1, destroy target artifact, destroy target creature with defender, or Smash to Dust deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. Again, classic card that you instantly can see has sideboard potential. It did kill something like 25% of the creatures in Dominaria United, but it didn't kill the high impact ones. So probably you wanted to put it again against an artifact-heavy deck, although it was not as good in those decks as Lucky Offering was. But also you can sideboard it in against some Defender synergy decks or some go-wide decks that had multiple X1s. Nevertheless, card was just not good enough to be played in the main deck for most of the time, and therefore it was assigned to the sideboard. Then we have Duress that was played 6.25 times more than in game 2 than in game 1. And these are definite top 3 of strictly sideboard cards. Then we go into this territory. I just assume that people know what duress does, so I'm not giving a picture of that. Then we go into the territory of the cards that are sometimes played in the main, but mostly from the sideboard. And here we have Broken Wings, two versions of it, and quite consistent because Broken Wings from was it Crimson Vow, I think, has 3.77 times more games twos than game ones. And then the other Broken Wings, 3.6. So this card has been quite reproducibly played in the main, but was still most frequently played from the sideboard. Broken Wings obviously destroy target creature, flying, artifact, or enchantment. And I guess that this is the card that in some formats can be decent in the main deck, and in some formats has to be exclusively in the sideboard. Just looking at this set, I will quickly try to see which version is which, so that you have a good information. Broken Wings. They have a Dominaria United version has 3.7 ratio, and the Streets of New Capenna version has 3.6 ratio. Quite interestingly, the version from Dominaria and the version from Streets of New Capenna had exactly the same win rate in game one if they were played in the main deck of 55.7%. But actually, in Dominaria, the win rate in games 2 and 3 increased, while in Streets of New Capenna, it actually decreased. So it was a decent sideboard card in Dominaria United, but it was a pretty bad, I would say, sideboard card in Streets of New Capenna, which is quite interesting because it's exactly the same card, just slightly different, format. Where am I? Then we have Red Sun's Twilight. This is the card that I actually played the main deck in best of one and had probably one of my most spectacular wins of the one using Red Sun's Twilight, that included killing 2 Cephalopod sentries and 3 other artifacts, and then also swinging with the copies of Cephalopod entries for lethal at the same turn for 22. So this card has a huge impact if you are playing against a deck that has multiple targets for it. But still, because there was plenty of incidental artifacts in one, Red Sun's Twilight was possibly playable in the main deck if you didn't have anything better to do. Because if I have a choice between putting like a mediocre creature or Red Sun's Twilight, I think I would pick Red Sun's Twilight if I was heavy on red enough, because mediocre creature is just going to do not much, while Red Sun's Twilight might do nothing in one game and then completely win another one, something that a mediocre common will not be able to do. Another card that was in this mid, sometimes played in the main, sometimes played in the sideboard range was Fog of War. Now, this card had a pretty small sample size, so keep the number with a pinch of, treat the number with a pinch of salt. Fog of War is an instant from Brothers War, and I absolutely didn't remember what it does when I read it. I remember that it's some sort of a fog, but the name, as the name suggests, but it says, you gain 1 life for each creature on the battlefield. Prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn by creatures with power 3 or less. So against some deck, it was a pretty decent trick. I never played the best of 3 in that format, but it looks to me that this card was pretty decent. It was 3 times more frequently played from the sideboard than it was played from the main deck. Further we go, Spell Pierce with the same numbers as Fog of War. Spell Pierce being a counter for instants and sorceries that you need to pay 2, unless if you don't want it to be countered. Then we have another counter spell. You can see that very situational removal, discard and counter spells targeting particular types of spells These are the cards we see in this category of the most sideboardy of cards. Another card we have here is an offer you can't refuse. It's an instant from Streets of New Capenna, costing blue. Counter target non-creature spell. Its controller creates 2 treasure tokens. So cheap counter with a huge downside. But I guess that if opponent was showing some kind of atrociously oppressive instant sorceries or generally non-creature spells, maybe like rabble rousing, it is worth giving them 2 treasure tokens and getting rid of a bomb level card. Oh, that's a good one, Kiefer. Thanks for reminding me, just in time. I always forget about it, and especially when I have a bit of a fever, it's not helping. So yeah, this is a very specific card that you will put against very specific decks, and you probably almost never play it in the main deck. Just to give you an impression of that, An Offer You Can't Refuse was played just 80 times as a main deck card and 250 times in game 2. While some of those cards had thousands of games in the main deck and only 1,000 and something extra as a sideboard card. So that's the difference between those two styles of the cards. Very good, Mercuria. How are you? I didn't get to ask you a question. Maybe you can have a question before we finish, so we can answer it live on the stream. Okay. Another one that we have as the most sideboardy cards, so the ones that are played mostly out of the sideboard, is Reckoner Shakedown. This is a sorcery for 3 mana, 2 and a black. Target opponent reveals their hand. You may choose a non-land card from it. If you do, that player discards that card. If you don't, put 2+1/+1 counters on a creature or a vehicle you control. So again, a situational duress or coercion, even with an upside. It was probably designed to be playable in the main deck because that fail case, if you cannot discard anything from opponent's hand, or you don't want to discard anything from the opponent's hand, you can make your creature larger. But it turned out that it was probably just not good enough as that, and because of that, it was part of the sideboard plan. And very often, as I said, you will see those cards, very specific removal, discard spells, and counter spells. These are the most predominant sideboard cards. Next, Extract the Truth, and here, hey, look at it. 1 and a black from Streets of New Capenna, sorcery. Choose 1. Target opponent reveals their hand. You may choose a creature, enchantment, or planeswalker card from it. That player discards that card, or target opponent sacrifices an enchantment. So an enchantment removal in black, or a 2 mana discard a creature or enchantment or planeswalker. So actually, this one, unlike Duress, deals with the permanence parts, while the Reckoning that we looked at before was dealing with any kind of card except for lands. Did I skip the one card? Explosive Entry, did I skip? Oh, I skipped Carnivorous Canopy. Okay, yeah. Carnivorous Canopy is also in that category. Carnivorous Canopy is the same basically as Broken Wings, but it can also proliferate. It's from 1, so we should know that card. That probably was the most sideboardy card in 1. And actually, Carnivorous Canopy was played quite frequently in the main deck in this format. I also main decked it sufficiently. This one was played like 1,600 times in the main deck and 3,700 in game 2. So probably 2,000 times from the sideboard, which makes it much more played like the An Offer You Can't Refuse that I told you, that only 90 games in game 1 and 250 in game 2. And the last card that we have here is Structural Assault. That's a card from Streets of New Capenna. Another classic example of a sideboard card. This one is very similar to Red Sun's Twilight. For 5 mana sorcery, 3 red, destroy all artifacts, and then it deals damage to each creature equal to the number of artifacts that were put into graveyards from the battlefield this turn. So a weird card that can act as a sweeper for artifacts, but also if your opponent plays artifacts, it can act as a sweeper. Um, is a sweeper for creatures. So pretty weird because you possibly can't really play into the board if you have that card in your hand, unlike when you have Red Sun's Twilight, when you can fully commit and then you just sweep one side of the board. This one really needed maybe more careful play and possibly was not as good as Red Sun's Twilight in the same function. Also, I mean, the artifact theme in Streets of New Capenna was not strong at all. I think that this card would have been probably quite good in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty as a sideboard card, but in Streets of New Capenna was, or in Bro, yeah, exactly. But in Streets of New Capenna was not so predominant. Still, it was a strictly sideboard card in that format, so it catches just at the end of the nominees list for the Oscars in most sideboardy card category. Right, next category, biggest positive impact. And to calculate the biggest positive impact, I calculated the game 2 win rate versus the game 1 win rate. Now, obviously, this has a slight problem. Obviously, some of those cards had like 8-fold difference between game 1 and game 2, and then those differences are quite telling if there is a difference between the win rate. Then some of those cards only had 15% more games in game 2 than in game 1, and then of course that positive impact was smaller because there was only fewer games when the card was sideboarded in. And that's why we'll have a second measure of this that is slightly different and has a whole different set of problems. So basically we're taking 2 biased metrics in order to maybe see which cards are defending themselves against both the types of those metrics, and because of that yeah, with cards that I main deck, you would expect this to be equal, right? Even though I did look at some at this, and there are some cards that had slightly lower win rate, they had win rate in game 2 lower than I would expect, and these were very often the cards that you would maybe like combat tricks and things like that. But I'm not talking about it today. I keep that analysis for maybe sometime later when I will have ability to analyze it a bit more stringently. But there were a couple of cards that I saw that there was differences in win rates between game 1, game 2, and game 3. But okay, so keep in mind that this one will probably slightly overlap with the previous category. Oh, what is the most winningest card ever recorded on 17 lands? That's it's called My Opponent's Top Deck Mercurio. Okay, I've tried to fish out that information in the end of the seminar, but yeah, I will keep that question. I have a couple of ideas. Okay. So the biggest positive impact on the win rate, Red Sun's Twilight. The card had roughly 50% win rate in game 1, and then it jumped to around 60% in game 2. So Red Sun's Twilight, obviously, red X, destroy X artifacts. If X was 5 or greater, then you create copies of those artifacts until end of turn on your side of the battlefield. It's percentage points difference, yeah. I shouldn't say ratio also. I don't know why it says ratio. It should say difference. Yes. And I think that this card led to multiple players' best plays of the format, basically, when they basically hosed the blue-white artifact deck completely in one turn. That's a big difference. That shows you that this card is amazing as a sideboard card because of this type of difference. And then second place is Fate from History. If you don't remember the cuteness of the bears, Fate from History is 2 green sorcery. Each player who controls an artifact or enchantment creates a 2/2 green bear creature token, then destroy all artifacts and enchantments. Again, it's a card that is very similar in a way to Red Sun's Twilight. It can basically wreck the plan of opponent. You want to play it in a deck that doesn't have too many artifacts and enchantments, maybe a couple just to get a bear. Um, Preferably ones that just generate value on ETB and then later disappear. So you may have like um, Elsewhere Flask, for example. Um, and then you destroy everything from on your opponent's side, leading to a possible game win if you are in the right matchup. So high impact card that is only good in very specific matchups. Perfect example of a solid sideboard card. And this one, just to give you the numbers, Fate from History. You move, Mr. Graph. I want to see the numbers. Fate from History. It has 48% win rate in game one, so not a good main deck card, but 58.7 in game two, which is actually pretty good. Right, next card, Defabricate. This one is a bit surprising, but it might be something to do with you can blame some of the result or attribute some of this result onto the small sample size maybe. But it's a 1 in blue instant. Choose one. Counter target artifact or enchantment spell. If a spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it onto its owner graveyard. Or counter target activated or triggered ability. This obviously can lead to some kind of blowouts, but it shouldn't have as big an effect as Red Sun's Twilight or Fate from History. But on the other hand, in Bro, exiling artifacts was good. As the chat very soberly suggests, it was the best answer to Scrapwork Cohort. To give you the numbers of that, Defabricate has, again, 48.9% win rate in the main deck, but 57.4 out of the sideboard. So, yeah, that's quite a big difference between first game one and game two. Then we have Duress, which is actually, you hear that, oh, Duress, keep that card for sideboard. But actually, Duress has a really solid numbers in those sideboard games. 7.4 percentage point difference between game one and game two win rate. And when we look at it, it's again 48% win rate in the main deck and 55 in the sideboard, which is fine. Then we have the Fog of War, the card that I mentioned, the sort of fog that gains some life and only stops creatures with power 3 or greater from dealing combat damage. That one has a 7 percentage points difference between the games it was played in game one and in game three. Now, the problem with this one is that the sample size for the game one is small, but also the perhaps even a bigger problem is that the win rate in game two when it was played is still very bad because it's only 43%. So the card makes it on the difference, but that doesn't mean it's a good sideboard card. It's just less bad in the game two when you play it than in game one when you should definitely not play it. Cut Your Losses. This card is an interesting one. It has a 5.7 percentage point difference between game one and game two. Cut Your Losses is a 6 mana sorcery, 4 blue. It has Casualty 2, and it says target player mills half their library rounded down. Now, some decks in Streets of New Capenna were going through a whole chunk of their library. So when you played this card, and especially with self-mill, this card was just good enough to win games and win this kind of mirror matchups between control decks like Grixis possibly. When there were cards that milled you, when there were cards that in blue-black self-mill was actual theme. And to look at the number on Cut Your Losses, It's 44%, 45% win rate in game one and 50% in game two. But I'm assuming that in some matchups that card was really good. So maybe the numbers are not given it full credit, mainly because it was not played as a sideboard card as frequently as some of the others. It was only 25% more played in the game two than in game one. And maybe in our next metric will give it a better result. So possibly the lesson from looking at the data of this card is, don't play cut your losses in your main deck unless you get a really good plan with it. And I think lots of people played it just because it was a rare and because the effect looks pretty good. Then we have the Reckoner Shakedown, but we already... Am I dumb? Yes. We have Reckoner Shakedown, but we already talked about this card. It has a 4.5% increase in the win rate, but I'm pretty sure that the card was not outside of the capable hands of Florida Man. It was maybe not great. It had a 50.5% win rate in game one and 55% win rate in game two. So it had an increased win rate when you played it in game two. But it was nothing spectacular. It was just decent, let's call it. Then we have You Find Some Prisoners. That's an instant, one in the red. It has two options. Either you destroy target artifact or you exile the top three cards of target opponent's library and choose one of them. Until end of your next turn, you may play that card and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. I honestly thought that this card might be actually not so bad in the main deck, drawing some cards out of the opponent, but not necessarily. It has a 4.4 difference between percentage point difference between game one and game two win rate. And You Find Some Prisoners. It had 51.7% win rate in game one and 56.1% game win rate in game two. I guess that probably it was not good enough as sort of draw stuff from your opponent's library card, but it was good enough when you could destroy an artifact, and if the opponent didn't play that artifact that they had, you could still use it as something to draw a card, potentially the artifact that you were put it in to destroy. Then we have the Smash to Dust. That's a 4 percentage point better than in game two than game one, but actually it had 56% win rate in game one and 60% in game two. So maybe Smash to Dust was the secret sideboard star and also a card that was possibly main deckable in best of three. Who knows? The numbers look better than most of the cards that we looked before. Then we have Explosive Entry. And I honestly have to go far back to find what Explosive Entry does. That was destroy target after artifact and put a +1/+1 counter on up to one target creature from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. And you got a full spoiler of the slides. There you go. This one has a 3.4 percentage point higher win rate in game two than in game one. Did it have a useful win rate in general? 58.3 in game one and 61.7 in game two. So yes, it had actually a decent win rate, shockingly. Probably because it was played in those aggressive red decks itself, and these decks just were super good, as Tab Jordan can attest to you. Then we have Lucky Offering, the destroy small artifact spell from Kamigawa that we talked about before. Lucky Offering was decent in game one even. It had 59.6% win rate in game one and 62.9 in game two. So yeah, it did some work. Aggressive Sabotage, that's a discard 2 spell from Dominaria United with a kicker of dealing 3 damage to a player that had a slightly higher win rate in game 2. Eyes of Beholder, very expensive, but basically unconditional removal from AFR and from not only AFR but Alchemy Horizons. And you line up the shot, the sort of weird version of Broken Wings, which basically, instead of doing what it normally does, it had options of conjuring a plummet, conjuring a naturalize, so destroy creature of flying, destroy a target artifact or enchantment, or you could just cycle it for 1 green to draw a card. This one also had 3 percentage points higher win rate in game 2 compared to game 1. And actually, it had a decent win rate in game 1, even. It had 58.1% win rate in game 1 and 61.3% in game 2. So these are the cards with the biggest positive impact, but I told you that this metric is biased towards the cards which are played way more in game 2 than in game 1, because obviously then the impact is going to be more visible. So what about the negative impact? And this is the same metric, but we look at the cards that actually perform worse in game 2 than in game 1. So these are the cards that people trap themselves into putting into their sideboard. And we start with Light the Way. That's a 1 mana instant. Choose one, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or vehicle. So like a permanent combat trick, but only gets +1/+1. Or return target permanent you control to its owner hand, so you can basically kill a removal spell. And this one had a 5 percentage points lower win rate in game 2 than in game 1, even though it was put by the people. So let's look at the numbers on it. It has 61% win rate in game 1s and 56% win rate in game 2. And I think that maybe it's not exclusively the effect of being sideboarded, because this card was not sideboarded that frequently. Again, only 25% more games 2s than game 1s on this card. So maybe the drop of the win rate of this card is linked to decreased win rate of the games when it was also played in game 1 and the opponent saw it and played around it, because this looks like one of those cards where actually the game 2 win rate is going to drop slightly. This is something Chronic, I hope that you know that we're talking only about best of 3 data. This may be an idea that there is a category of cards that you should sideboard out after game 1 if opponents saw them. And Light of the Way, combat tricks should be maybe those cards. Maybe if you're playing best of 3, the best idea is to remove the cards that the opponent will be playing around. Because if you do that, they will play around those cards, and at the same time you won't have them, so you won't care that they are playing around them, and you can put cards that definitely have impact against their deck. If they saw it, Mercurio, if they saw it. If they didn't see the Mana Tithe, you can basically keep it. So Light of the Way, the worst, even though it had a decent win rate in game 1. Second is you find the Villain's Lair. That's 1 blue instant, choose one, counter target spell, or draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards. So sort of cancel with an option to become Faithless Looting. And this one drops by 3.5 percentage points. You find the Villain's Lair. It had 54% win rate in game 1, and it drops to 50%. Again, this card might drop because also when it's seen, people play around it and maybe don't present the best spell early. If you keep the mana open and they don't do anything, you are behind on something. So it might not be necessarily that it's a bad sideboard card. It might be just that it's a bad game 2 card, and it's hard to distinguish between those things. Then we have Urza Silex. That card has been surprisingly sideboarded in a lot. This is a 3 mana artifact, legendary, mythic. And for 2 white and tap and exiling it, Each player chooses 6 lands they control. Destroy all other permanents. Activate only as a sorcery. And when it's put into exile from the battlefield, you may pay 2. If you do, search your library for a Planeswalker card, reveal it, put it in your hand, and then shuffle. I assume that if you sideboard it in, you don't have the Planeswalker, you just do it because you're playing against an aggressive deck. The problem with Silex is that Silex is just not that good of a sweeper. Opponent knows about it, turn in advance. It can be killed before it can get activated unless they have 7 mana on board, which is quite late for a sweeper. So yeah, many things against it, and it has actually a 3.2% win rate, lower win rate in game 2, and win rate in game 1 was already at 51%, and it just drops to 47, which is I think the lowest number of all the cards in the list. Oh, I'm sorry, Fog of War. Fog of War is the worst card in there. But it's definitely not a good one. And it becomes even worse as a sideboard card. Then we have Incriminate. 1 and a black for the sorcery. Choose 2 target creatures controlled by the same player. That player sacrifices one of them. So best case scenario, you're playing against a deck with quite flat level of threats, and then it just acts as a removal of the worst one, or the second best creature that the opponent controls. And I guess it's not such a great card if you are sideboarding it in, because I don't know what I would be sideboarding it in against, to be fair. And Incriminate, the numbers on it, 54.5% win rate in game 1, 51.7% in game 2. So it doesn't have that great numbers as a sideboard card either. Then we have Kindled Fury. That's a 1 mana instant from Kamigawa. Target creature gets +1/+0 and gains first strike until end of turn. I thought this card might be better, but actually it just didn't play enough with the themes of the decks that it could be theoretically put into. Kindled Fury had a solid 59% win rate in game 1, actually, and then it just drops to 56 in game 2. Again, potentially not because of sideboarding, but because of tricks being just worse in game 2. Then we have Structural Assault. Structural Assault was the artifact sweeper from Streets of New Capenna. We already talked about it. But exactly, the card was just not strong enough. I think that the drawback of if you destroy something, you also wipe your own board is too much for it. Then we have Kaito's Pursuit. Target player discards 2 cards. Ninjas and rogues you control gain menace until end of turn. And not a strong impact on in your post-sideboard games. It did start at 59% win rate in game 1, and it dropped to 57. Now keep in mind, if you're used to the best of 1 data, numbers in best of 3 are slightly higher. So 59 is not like amazing even for a common. It's just okay. We have Negate. That also drops, but actually Negate's win rate in main deck was quite high, and it can also drop because people play against it if they saw it in the actual games. So it was not a strictly sideboard card in that format. I'm sure that we'll see some formats soon where Negate is a strictly sideboard card, and then those numbers might look very different. Arc Spitter. No one remembers that equipment from Streets of New Capenna, but it gives the creature 1. This creature deals 1 damage to target creature that's blocking it. So it sort of gave unblockable to a creature, but not really, because if they really needed to block, they could. So yeah, I don't know why people would put this, maybe against some highly defensive decks to try to push damage through. Gleeful Demolition is the 1 red. It's a red mana sorcery from 1. Destroy an artifact, and if you controlled it, then create 3 1/1 Phyrexian goblins. That card doesn't show amazing numbers in terms of improvement when you put it from sideboard. And in this case, it might be because people that main deck it had a plan of making 3/1/1 goblins, and it was more important than destroying the artifact. While people who sideboarded probably only want to sideboard it to destroy artifacts, which means that the card has a lower impact than in decks where it had this dual use. Again, this shows you that those modal cards, you want to make sure that both of the modes are accessible. Guardians of Oboro, that's a 3 mana, so 2 and a blue, 3/4 Moonfolk Samurai with Defender. Modified creatures you control have an attack, can attack as though they didn't have Defender. Again, this is the card that when it's main decked, it's probably with the theme in mind. So there were a couple of really strong defenders in that format. So if you were capable of modifying them with Guardians of Oboro, you could actually generate quite a large attackers for quite cheap in this format. So maybe Guardians of Oboro as a strictly defensive card was not that good because it just didn't do enough. Although I think if I played against like a red aggressive deck, I would maybe put Guardians of Oboro if I was especially on the draw after game one to make sure that I can stop the offensive quite efficiently. Then we have Disruption Protocol, another Kamigawa card. That's a counter spell that an additional cost to cast this spell. You need to tap an untapped artifact you control or pay 1. And it counters target spell. Then we have Disdainful Stroke, so another counter spell, and Planar Incision, which is an instant that exiles target artifact or creature and then returns it to the battlefield under its owner control with a +1/+1 counter on it. So when we look at it, we have instant, artifact, sorcery, instant, sorcery, instant, artifact, sorcery, creature, instant. I would say that most of the cards on the list of the biggest negative impact are actual instants. And if you look at the same thing with the positive, we have sorcery, instant, sorcery, instant, sorcery, instant, sorcery, instant, sorcery, instant, I think. So here we also have like a good split of sorceries and instant. I think that the most important observation from those lists is that most of the cards that people sideboard in are spells and not permanent. Permanent as a sideboard cards are a slightly rarer thing to happen. Here we saw a couple of them, but not on the good side of the sideboard card. If in the good ones, all of them were spells, based on creature spells, while the bad ones did contain some creatures. I think that the ones with the negative impact, you have to keep in mind that the likely reason for why their impact is negative may be because when they are played as a main deck card, they spoil their surprise, and therefore that lowers the win rate rather than the actual inclusion in the sideboard. But it's very hard to measure every instance of time that the card was sideboarded. So we have the last category, and this is going to be highest estimated sideboard win rate. And how did I estimate the sideboard win rate? I basically assumed that if you played it in game one, you play it roughly the same amount of time in game two. Therefore, the actual sideboarding win rate will be wins in game one minus wins in game. It should be wins in game two minus wins in game one. Let's correct it before someone notices. Go back to the slideshow. So it will be wins in game two minus wins in game one, because obviously you played more games in game two than in game one, and then divided by games in game two minus games in game one. So we take away the baseline of the how often is the card played in the main deck, and what we end up with is the ratio of the extra games when it was sideboarded in. It's a rough estimate because I assume that those cards will be sometimes also taken away of the deck, and not only put into the deck when they were main deck. But it should be roughly showing us the impact only in the games when the card was put from the sideboard, rather than in the games that the card was um, also in the main deck, which made it problematic the first measure, especially with the cards that were not sideboarded very frequently. So here are the cards with this highest estimated sideboard win rate. And number one is the Cut Your Losses, the mill spell that we were talking about. It didn't have impressive win rate, but I think it didn't have an impressive win rate because people were playing it too much in the main deck. Once you remove the main deck games from the equation, it was actually an excellent sideboard card that allowed you to win those grindy matchups very frequently. And I think Sam Black was talking about that card during the Streets of New Capenna as one of the better sideboard options in the format. And here is the number that confirms it. Second one was the You Line Up the Shot. So that's the Broken Wings variety from Alchemy Horizons. Then we have Fate from History, which was not only on the highest estimated sideboard win rate, but also on the biggest difference between game one and game two, confirming that this card is just a good sideboard card, however you measure it. Then we have Aggressive Sabotage. That was the discard 2 spell. I guess there were some matchups in Bro where in Dominaria United when this card was particularly good. We already talked about this card. Eyes of the Beholder. I guess you put it to deal with a particular threat that otherwise is hard to destroy, and it seems to be playing its role because it has this estimated sideboard win rate of 70%. And then we have Nahiri's Sacrifice. I know it's from the current set, but maybe none of you remembers it. 1 in a red sorcery as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact or creature with mana value X, and it deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures. So yeah, it probably was good against some kind of thank you, Doors, for closing yourselves. It was probably good against decks that had a bunch of X1s, and you sacrifice like a free drop and you kill 3 of their creatures. So you basically 3 for 2 them, and that may be enough against some strategies. Then we have the Fabricate, the counter spell for artifacts and enchantments or activated abilities. Yes, or against pacifism full deck when you can just sacrifice the thing that is under pacifism and you're actually, instead of having a useless thing on the board, you kill something at least. And especially that pacifisms will frequently target expensive creatures. That's a very good common to key for. Then what we have is Temporary Lockdown. It's a 3-mana enchantment, 1 white. When it enters the battlefield, exile each non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less until it leaves the battlefield. So sort of like a Wrath, but only for small things. It has a decent 68% win rate from the sideboard on the estimate. Another card we have on the list is Guardian Naga from Alchemy Horizons. And this one probably was just not good enough to main deck because it's a 7-mana 5/6 with Vigilance, and as long as it's your turn, prevent all damage that will be dealt to it. But it had an adventure of instant exile target artifact or enchantment for 2 and a white. And if you played against a deck that had some significant artifacts or enchantment, or if you played a deck where you knew that you're going to play a long game enough where 7-drop is actually feasible, that's from Alchemy Horizons, Chronic 33. So Heroes of Baldur's Gate. If you play the game against a deck when you think that you can get it so long that you will get to 7 mana and you can drop this 5/6 that is very, very difficult to kill, it might have been good just as this kind of thing in your deck. If you knew that the opposing deck is not having many ways of dealing with such a thing like that, you could have just won the game by playing Naga on its own. And still potential of exiling some of their equipment, some of their artifacts or enchantments. And it has 67% win rate as a sideboard card estimate. Shoot Down, that's from Brothers War, 3 and a green sorcery. Exile target artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. The card was just probably not good enough as a main deck card. I can just check what was the game 1 win rate of the Shoot Down. It was 56.5, which again for best of 3 is not good enough, but it had a very reasonable 58% win rate in game 2 and roughly the same in game 3. So as a sideboard card, it seems like it was doing much better. I think that the problem of this card was that it was sideboard mainboarded a bit too frequently, and especially in best of 3. If you can avoid it, you can avoid it. You still have game 2 and 3 potentially to use the full power of this card, and by not playing it in your main deck, you give yourself better chance of not having a dead card in your hand. Another card from Alchemy Horizons, Mind Spike, is on the list. That's 65% estimated win as a sideboard win rate as a sideboard card. That's a 1-mana sorcery. Target opponent reveals each non-creature, non-land card in their hand. You choose a card revealed this way. A player discards that card. You lose 2 life. If they didn't reveal a card this way, you draw a card. So it's, again, they try to make those discard spells that are conditional but have a failsafe. I don't think that this failsafe is enough to, at least for the current designs, those failsafes were not enough to make them main deckable. We've seen a couple of the cards before that were actually main deckable. I'm thinking about Toll of the Invasion. That was the 3-mana discard a card that is a non-land card from the opponent's hand, and you made a 1-1, or you amass 1, so you make the 1-1 army. And that card was just good enough to be played main deck because it made a body. It was like a ravenous rat that can actually choose something but costs 1 mana more. But this one is just not good enough. The fact that when you miss, you draw a card is not good enough. And the fact that you also lose 2 life when it works is not something that you want in this super aggressive format. But against some decks in put from the sideboard, it was actually quite okay. It actually had like 57% win rate in game 1 and 58% win rate in game 2. Next one is Hoarding Recluse. That's another after shoot down way of dealing with flyers in green in Brothers War. It's a 4-mana 2/3 reach death touch creature, and when it dies, you can put up to 1 other target card from a graveyard on the bottom of its owner's library. And I have to say that, like an idiot, I attacked into the Recluse a couple of times, forgetting that I have an unearthed creature in my graveyard, and then it was put on the bottom of my library, which was a sad moment for me. But yeah, card has a decent 65% win rate as a sideboard card, as an estimate. And then we have Red Sun's Twilight. We talked about this card already before, 64%, and Explosive Entry. Destroy up to 1 target artifact, sorcery spell, but you get to put a +1/+1 counter on 1 target creature you control. So that's a 64% win rate as a sideboard card, which is decent, which means that you definitely have spots for that card to be good. So yeah, these are the Oscars. These are the best cards to cut your losses, to make sure that you are going to win those games 2 and 3 and best of 3, because I've heard this on and on that really good players, when they play big tournaments, they very often will win the game 1, but they are so much more favored in games 2 and 3 because not only they are better players, and maybe in the first game they got unlucky, but also because they have good sideboard plans and they are able to utilize. Now, I really hope that looking at the list of those cards that were good as a sideboard cards and maybe not so good can give you some ideas on when should you sideboard, what cards should you consider sideboarding, and also which cards you can actually consider picking up highly as a speculative sideboard cards in best of three formats. Like, for example, from this data, things like Fate from History or Red Sun's Twilight, I think are worth speculating somewhere in the mid pack if you're already in the right color, because not only you get precious gems from them eventually when you draft enough, but also they will win some games on their own when you're playing best of three, when you can actually pick nice spots to play them. Right now, before we finish, I will try to answer Mercurio Blue's question, because Mercurio is one of my patrons that can ask a question every single episode. He's the only one in the tier, and therefore he's got the exclusive rights to ask questions in each episode. And today they are asking, what is the winningest card ever recorded on 17 lands? And to do that, we are going to stop the screen. We have to cope with seeing me in full screen for a second. 17 lands. I actually don't know. So we're going to try to find out. And we're going to, of course, look at the best of one only, Premier Draft. And we're going to look at the game and hand win rate. And present, share screen, 17 lands. Okay. Obviously, also thank you very much, Mercurio, for gifting the sub. And thanks, Papataco, for the raid. I didn't notice that you raided before, but now I did. So let's look at the game and hand win rate. Here we have that column. In one, the best card was Nissa. And it had 66.8, but I think we can go higher than that. Let's go to the weird formats. And weird formats will have weird things. And we have Hex Gold Sledge from the Alchemy version of one. This card has 70.4 game and hand win rate as an uncommon. It's a 2 and a red artifact equipment with 4 Mirrodin. When Hex Gold Sledge enters the battlefield, conjure a card named Goblin Cavalier, which I have no idea what it is, but it must be some creature, onto the battlefield. Equipped creature gets +1/+0. So it's basically 3 mana, create a 2/2, make an equipment, and conjure a creature onto the battlefield. So I guess that that's pretty good, and a 70% win rate. Yeah, exactly. That's pretty good, and it's an uncommon that has a higher win rate than this. Obviously, those small sample sizes in those alchemy drafts. But let's go if we can find something over 70.4. Bro Alchemy, 71% for Giggs Command. But again, super small size. So I'm not going to count this one. 68.5 Titania's Command. I think that this one is so far winning for the main sets. We go to DMU. 68.7, so slightly higher for Shieldred the Apocalypse. So far Shieldred is winning our competition. I'm going to ignore whatever Chaos Draft is, go to the Alchemy Horizon. The Hourglass Coven, 72.1% win game and hand win rate. That's going to be super hard to beat. So Hourglass Coven is a 4 black legendary creature hag warlock, and when it enters the battlefield, draft a card from the Hourglass Coven spellbook twice and put those cards onto the battlefield. And those cards are all warlocks. And other warlocks you control get +1/+1. So it's basically 6 mana to put 3 bodies, 9/9 onto the battlefield. You can imagine that this is going to be quite strong. And in the same set, we had Lae'zel, which was also stronger than anything so far with 71.1% win rate. So Hourglass Coven, 72.1. I don't think anything is going to beat that. Streets of New Capenna, Alchemy, there's Herald of Vengeance, that has 66%. That's not impressive. Streets of New Capenna itself, 68.7 Sanctuary Warden, so not even close to the Hourglass Coven, which was only a rare, by the way. Kamigawa, 68.5, Jugon defends the temple. So, most of the time, those cards that have high win rates are around that 68%. Henrika Domnathi in double feature, 68.7. Crimson Vow, Toxrill with 67 only. You see, people are complaining about those unbeatable bombs in Crimson Vow, but Toxrill, Halana Alena, Dreadfast Demon all have like 67, 66% win rate, while Hourglass Coven has 72. Meathook Massacre, 67.6. That's not even close. AFR, 66.9. Nadar Selfless Paladin. So that's a very sensible win rate. Strixhaven, Mascot Exhibition, 67.7. Also not that much, to be fair. Game and hand win rate. J2S Josh, Crimson Vow was a great format. Yes, I think it was a great format, and you can play it now as a bot draft. That was definitely not correct, Mercurio, if you go to pick 1, pack 2, Hourglass Coven. Oh, here we finally get some cards that are close in the range, but not even there. Starnheim Unleashed and Coma Cosmos Serpent in Kaldheim have around 70% win rate. Kaladesh Remastered. Sky Sovereign Console Flagship, 73% game in hand win rate. That beats Hourglass Coven. You need a boat. You need a bigger boat to beat the Hourglass Coven. Zendikar Rising. Luminarch Aspirant, 67. Not close. Amonkhet Remastered, 71.4. Scarab God. So boat beats God by quite enough. Okay, and here we start getting no data because possibly we're out of the time frame. Ikoria Snapdax, so the Mardu Apex, 67.8. Look at how low the win rates in Ikoria were. That's why this format was so great. Theros Beyond Death. Ooh, wow. Now we're talking. Obviously, smaller sample sizes because it was ages ago. Maybe we have to go back in time. Will it change something? No, it won't. So for the logged games in Theros Beyond Death, Ashiok Nightmare's Muse has 74.7% win rate. Small sample size, though. I'd like to stress that hard. Throne of Eldraine, Oko, 72%. M20, nothing. War of Spark, Sarkhan, 69, nice. But that's strange that M sets had no Premier Draft ever. Siege Gang Commander, 68% from Dominaria original run. Rivals of Ixalan should have nothing. Guilds of Ravnica should have something, but it's only 64%. RNA has 69.6. Ethereal Absolution, again, small sample size. And Ixalan itself, 0 probably, because it didn't have human drafts. So the answer to your question, Mercurio, is that the highest win rate card in all history of best of one human drafts is Ashiok, Nightmare's Muse. No, actually, Ashiok had a higher win rate than the big boat. So that is the answer to my Patreon question for this week. And with that, I'm going to move to stop screen, present, share screen. I'm going to move to acknowledgements. So I would like to thank 17 Lens people, Viral Misnomer, Hululu, Grant Wu, ZTM. This is the thank you to Pekka Puli for the Archetypist, which I'm still have to put that episode on YouTube, but and in the podcast form, but soon, I guess. And thanks to Fake Jake Brown, who is helping with the podcast release. Thanks to the Patreons, unfortunately. Sad moment. I don't have any new patrons to report, but hopefully with the new set coming out soon, we will change that very quickly. And also thanks to Esescu and Mano Junkie for providing the soundtrack for the podcast version of it. And with that, I'll see you next week.